Well, hi. How are
Hi,
you, Bridget?
I'm great. You?
Good, good. I'm glad we have some time to get together.
Okay, so I froze my eggs. I actually just had to count today how long ago it was. It was 5 years this summer. And prior to actually freezing my eggs, I had thought about it for about 18 months. And I think actually pulling the trigger and moving forward with it, I had done some initial research, but when I froze my eggs in 2011, there was not a lot of information. Not a lot of women were doing it. There were no websites that were specifically devoted to egg freezing. So it was a very different scene than it is today. And I think that sort of pushed me off a little bit because I just didn't have the information I needed. So when I finally decided to freeze my eggs and actually undergo some of the testing that was needed to sort of check my ovarian reserve, I wish I had done it, when I initially started thinking about it. But that said, I went forward, I got my testing done, and I, expected everything to be great tests, and they weren't good. And the doctor I went to see basically said, I want you, if you're going to move forward with this, let's get you on the books and let's get you going today. Froze my eggs, and then I started a website called Eggsurance. And the reason for starting the website, it was when I froze my eggs, I felt very alone. I felt scared. I felt isolated. It was it was emotionally a very, very hard time for me. And I realized that really I wasn't all that unique, that a lot of women were going to start doing this. The technology was that much better. And I wanted to create a community for women that we could talk about it, that we could share our stories, and that, it was a safe place. And that Eggsurance started with that premise, and it's still the mission today, that the guiding principle that it is one place for women to come and share their stories. And when I froze my eggs, I was very, very adamant that I wanted a traditional family. So I wanted to freeze my eggs and then hopefully wait and meet this man of my dreams. And that hasn't happened. So fast forward 5 years. I am still single. Luckily, I have eggs that are 39-year-old eggs instead of 43-year-old eggs. So, I started shifting, I think about 2 years ago, starting to think, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to meet the man, and maybe this traditional sense of a family that I always thought I wanted and saw isn't going to happen. So, is single motherhood something that I really want to pursue and want to start looking into? And, I think that one of the things with egg freezing, and I think a commonality I've heard from women over and over again is, it's almost this decision tree. And this decision tree keeps getting more and more convoluted, the depending on your circumstance, depending on. So I thought, I freeze my eggs, I'm done, meet the guy, it's easy. I gave myself the assurance that I had done everything possible. It's not a sure thing. And I think that, that's one thing. But I had gone as much, as possible in terms of preserving my own eggs.
Right.
And, I'm at the point now where sort of I'm in that decision tree where, yeah, I'd love to meet someone, but I am making the steps to start the process of actually using my eggs. And it's a slow process because mentally, I'm not 100% there yet. I think part of me really, still hopes that I would have that traditional family that I grew up in and, I thought I always wanted to have. However, I do, and it's interesting when you freeze your eggs, prior to freezing your eggs, the biological clock starts ticking, and then your actual egg freezing clock starts ticking of, after a certain point, there's no point freezing your eggs because your ovarian reserve quality is so low. And then there's a third line in the sand, which is how old is too old?
To
And
become a choice mom?
yes. And I'm at that third point where I am turning 44 this summer, and my initial line was 42. Well, I've well past 42, and now it's 45. So it's this, it's a complex journey. I think it's very important for women to, really own their own fertility and start talking about it and, doing videos and sharing stories like you're doing through your site, because we are not talking about it. And you get someone like me who was 39 who, had I known, I would have researched my ovarian reserve. I would have done some testing. I would have talked to doctors. Instead, the conversation I was having with my doctors, mainly gynecologists, were, what are you using for protection? Not, hey, let's do some tests. You're 36. What are your plans for creating a family? And, it was sort of a slap in the face when I went for my initial workup at a very reputable clinic. They lumped me into an IVF group in terms of training on
how to inject the meds
and sort of the whole process and the flow of things. And I walked in 8:00 in the morning, and the woman looks at me and sort of smiles and says, "Should we wait for your partner?" And I
heart sink.
Was very, very, very close to walking out. And one of the first women I interviewed for Eggsurance, very similar situation happened. So, fast forward 5 years, it's a very different world out there. I think that, people, when you look at a sort of an egg freezing patient versus an IVF patient, it's completely different scenarios. The IVF patient wants the baby now. That is their motivation. An egg freezing patient, it could be someone like me who is at the end sort of their fertile years and wants to preserve their fertility. There may be, women that are younger. And I think that's changing, of looking at people like me and saying, I don't want to be there. I want to, I have the money, I have the means, I'm going to do it now because the technology is there.
Right.
So I think there's been, sort of a monumental shift in the egg freezing landscape. And that has to do with the number of women doing it, the media recognition, and really just the technology net that, that's changed and it's improved. When you look at the women, and I've been in a lot of articles, I know a lot of women who've been interviewed for these articles, you're freezing your eggs because you want to preserve your fertility. I know no one who has been pushed because, their parents want to be grandparents, or, their work is telling them they need to work 16-hour days and they can't possibly. I think that when you look at media, and that comes back to women talking to women in places that women can talk to women, is we're getting all this noise out here because it's an interesting story to jump on, as a society. Culturally, we don't talk. In People magazine, all these actresses that are having their own kids, how many of them a lot of those are egg donors.
And we're not talking about it.
That's not talked about. And I think that is really
misleading.
It's very misleading. And I've had so many discussions with people of, you don't give up on it. My cousin's sister's best friend had a baby when she was 46.
I hear that all the time. The situational so-and-so had a baby at 40 something. Mm-hmm. That's great for her.
Yeah. No, it's, and I think at the end of the day, we have more choices, we have more options. And also just from a timing perspective, I got out of business school when I was 32. I got into a different career after business school, which pushed me into, 4 years of working very, very hard. And at that time, I got divorced as well. So I sort of was 36 when I came up for air from a career I had been building, and sort of said, wow, I'm 36 and I would love to be dating someone, but I'm not meeting anyone. I'm not having a lot of time. And, you think that's when you really, and then I sort of, when I wasn't with someone, then I went through sort of a cycle of depression of sort of what's wrong with me? Why am I not meeting anyone? My friends were starting to have kids. And I think that almost put me back, because you start to sort of lose your confidence in terms of, why am I not meeting anyone, which is a double-edged sword completely, because that was probably keeping me from meeting someone. And
Well, and
um,
then we didn't even talk about the healing part of a divorce. I mean, that's just, we glossed over it. You know what I'm
yep,
saying? Like, that's tough.
yep, no, that's a good point.
I mean, you thought your future
Yep,
was with him, you
yep,
know? And when that didn't work out, then you have to go back to the dating pool, which has
yep,
changed just as much as egg freezing,
yeah,
frankly.
yeah. No, and I'm in sort of a very interesting place now where, and there almost should be, a box in Match.com for have you frozen your eggs, because then that changes your, because there's so many guys. I mean, I'm back on Match.com right now, and guys in their 50s who definitely want kids, and it
Wow.
just is and I know, obviously they can have kids because
Hmm.
they're not the one having their kids, but does that but their age range of women is up till 42, which I just think it's been an interesting experience that how many 42-year-olds, so you're going to have to meet the person, date the person, by the time that person maybe is ready to have kids and settle down with you, they're 43.
Well,
So
and they may look you over because you're a few years older than 42, but they didn't know you have your eggs frozen, which gives you a
yeah,
better chance than the 42-year-old who
yeah,
didn't freeze her eggs.
yeah. And
So,
yeah, and having that discussion with someone you meet on Match.com that
and
my
I
eggs
don't think
are
guys
frozen, so
get
don't
it.
worry. um,
Hmm. Wow, you're at some really big crossroads, and it seems like you're really working through it and figuring it out, though.
Yeah, I mean it's I I think, and I just keep going back to I'm at a lot of sort of, you're right, crossroads in my life, and I'm so happy that, I had just turned 39. I was 39 in a month, that I went through with it. I froze my eggs. I have 11 eggs, in the freezer somewhere. And
Were
um,
they vitrified, the fast freeze, or were they slow freeze?
They're vitrified. So I got really, no one was doing slow freezing anymore at that point when I froze my eggs, and I hope no one's still doing it.
I know, me too.
Uh, but no, it was they were vitrified, and I toyed with, and I sort of look back now about doing a second cycle. Uh,
Hmm.
but by the time I really thought about it, it was sort of and people always ask me, oh, or is it physically painful, or are the shots painful? And
Right.
really, from a physical point of view, yes, you get bloated for a few days, but it was really the emotional sort of toll that the egg freezing took. I needed, some time to sort of recover from that, and
Absolutely.
realize, I'd done it, they're in the bank. And then by the time I started thinking, oh, maybe I should do a second cycle, I was already,
Ready to move on.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, I felt like that too. I only did one cycle as well, and I was surprised how much I changed during that month. It's only a month of your life, but it definitely got the whole concept really for real. Like I felt real after you did that.
Egg freezing sort of has given me, and I think a lot of other women, sort of some time and more options than had I just sat back and said, I hope I meet someone. I'd
Hmm.
hope I have a baby someday. I hope. And in the scheme of things, when I look at the amount of money I invested in freezing my eggs over that, period of time, of just the emotional toll it would have taken. I mean, it's, even if, I decide to use my eggs and they don't work, yes, I'll be upset, but I know that,
Emotionally.
yeah, I mean, it would be a very hard situation if I decided to use them and they didn't work, but
Hmm.
I'd rather have them not work than never have frozen my eggs and never have had this option.
It's really profound. That's great. I feel the same way.
But that's another thing that and when you sort of talk about decision trees, one of the or options, when I do start to think about freezing my eggs, in the back of my mind, but I only have 11, and maybe they're not, maybe I'm not going to get pregnant. And, that's something I sort of push past because, I know, yes, that's a possibility. It's not a sure thing. Um, but, I do have that possibility. Whereas, having nothing, there would not even be an opportunity to
Well,
try that.
11 is better than 0.
Yeah.
11's great.
Yeah. 11 is much better than
And
0.
11 at 39, you really need to pat yourself on the back. That's a great result.
It's interesting, how the amount of thought pre-egg freezing, and then when I did it, it just sort of seemed like that was easy. Why didn't I do that earlier?
Right.
Right. And I guess that's, one thing that I would tell people who are thinking about it is, your eggs aren't getting any younger. Don't draw this out into a long, cycle. If you have the means to do it now. Do it as soon as you start thinking about it, because chances are you're going to end up doing it. And if you've had, a long 12 months of thinking about it, especially someone like me who is at the higher end of the spectrum age-wise, think of the results I could have gotten a year earlier.
Right.
I haven't talked to anyone who has regretted freezing their eggs.
That's a
And,
good point.
and I think that, and it will be interesting, with sort of the people that froze their eggs around the time that I did. I think that sort of group of people, not early adopters, but, early-ish.
Yeah, you're early.
When they're starting to come back and use them. And I think, I'm, in some sense, I'm very excited because I think that, we'll have sort of proof points and hopefully success stories. On the other hand, I'm a little bit nervous because it's obviously not going to work for everyone. Not everyone is going to get pregnant. And I am nervous for a little bit of backlash and of people saying, I froze my eggs and it didn't work, and you shouldn't do it because it's not going to work for you. So the quality of your clinic, the quality of your doctor, the quality of, the lab, and, not all egg freezing is alike. It takes experience, and your sort of more reputable, your more experienced clinics are going to have better success rates. And so really, before you go in to freeze your eggs, is really doing your due diligence and either talking to women who have used that clinic, really going into your doctor with a very solid list. I mean, there's a million lists out there, line of questions. One that really spend some time and figure out, is this someone that,
we're comfortable.
Figure out, you're comfortable with. Can you get that to them easily from work? There's a lot of different factors, I think, going into egg freezing, that it's not, to me, and I've said this a lot, it's not just a physical procedure. It's extremely emotional, and there's, a very sort of strong emotional sort of toll it takes. And when looking into it and getting a clinic and getting a place you want to go, is making sure that you feel good when you're there.
I think doing it alone it's very challenging. As strong as a lot of other people are, it still is a little bit of sadness. Like, I felt sad.
Yeah,
and that was before the hormone shots, so I couldn't blame it on the hormone shots.
Well,
during the hormones, I cried like a baby at commercials, but
no, when the doorbell rang and my meds arrived, and I, ran to the door, and I guess I was expecting a shoebox. I didn't even know what I was expecting, and this massive box arrives that I had to like kick across the floor, and I lost it. And, of all things, like, I hadn't even injected myself. It was just, in my mind, a shoebox was arriving. And I get this huge thing from the box and put them in the freezer. And realized 10 minutes later, after I'd read some of the instructions, that they should have gone in the fridge. So, I mean, there were things like that happened.
Wait, back up. Tell me that part again. So when you got the box of meds and you started sorting through the box,
and
you put some in the freezer and they should have gone in the refrigerator.
I put them all in the freezer.
Oh. Were they okay?
Yeah.
Okay. That is a funny story, though.
But I mean, it's just, I think it's indicative of sort of, I was a little crazed. I didn't really know what to do with them as soon as they came. And I don't know why knee-jerk reaction was, they're cold. I need to keep them
Well, we're
cold.
freezing our eggs, right? Of course they
Yes.
go in the freezer.
You know what? That was probably it. It was sort of a subliminal, I'm going to freeze these. That was the sort of kickoff of my egg freezing sort of adventure when things when it went to sort of the physical starting to give the shots and I've never given myself a shot in my life. I hate shots. I hate blood. I and that was an interesting part for me. I mean, the first shot was hard.
Hmm. The
It's
first one was challenging.
it's hard to, I think, what are you putting in your body? Is this going to hurt? All of that. And by the end, I was doing shots in my car. I remember I did one in a public restroom because I was just getting, I was just
You
turning.
were a
And
pro.
thinking back on it now, I think I felt just really empowered in a way that, I was doing this. I could give myself a shot. I could follow through with this. I didn't need anyone sort of, and and also just seeing the change from it's only 12 days of giving yourself shots, and within from day 1 to like day 3 it wasn't a problem.
Right. You had the routine down.
Got the routine down, and really that was one of the most that was one of the aspects of egg freezing I was the most nervous about.
Hmm.
And that in the end was one of the aspects that I really felt, hey, I'm in control. I can do this. I can. And that was an interesting shift that I didn't expect. The shots are a piece of cake in the end. I think the hardest thing is the decision to actually freeze your eggs. Because once you've done that, the rest sort of falls into place. I've come to realize through this experience that I am a very open person. I didn't realize, sort of how open I am about my life, and sort of, and realizing that if my story can help one person or two people, then I'm going to tell it, because I went through, a lot of very dark years leading up to freezing my eggs. As a direct result of, am I going to meet someone? Am I going to have this family I wanted? And so for me, my situation, it was very important that I had a story to tell that could potentially help people either make a decision or go through with something. I was going to tell it. And I think it makes me a little bit sad that there are so many women that are sort of reticent to tell their story, or, want to be anonymous or a Jane Doe, or I'll tell my story only if you don't use these parts of it. While I respect that, I wish, and this goes back to the discussion of fertility and being open and having these dialogues. If you can't even have a dialogue about freezing your eggs, we're kind of lost in terms of, all sort of the pre-part. And so I think it's important for, women to start this dialogue and be open about it. It's not a dirty secret. It's your fertility and, family planning. And we need to sort of talk to people who are younger than us and have them, at work, people, millennials, people in their 20s. I sort of take most women and start shaking them and say,
Well, if you can get past the eye rolls, you're doing
yes.
good.
Yeah.
Because they look at us like we're ancient.
Yes. Well, that too. And just sort of saying, uh, this is something you need to consider sooner rather than later. It's not a dirty subject. It's not something that you should sort of put in your back pocket but start thinking about this. And, there are some tests you can take. And most people don't even know that, there's an FSH or an AMH test that, is relatively inexpensive. It's just not something on people's radar. And so
That's a very good point.
and I usually tell, younger women that I talk to is take the test now, get a baseline, when you're 30, and sort of start taking it and see where you are. I mean, hopefully you've got great levels and you can sort of assess it from there and take it a year from then and, start seeing how things are shifting.
Well, you've been nothing but a resource for others, and definitely have changed the gear of how we look at fertility. And whether you realize it or not, you've been a huge role model for a lot of women. I know I look up to you a lot and appreciate all the things you've done. So just with that in mind, do you have any final thoughts or advice you would give the average woman that maybe considering egg freezing, but is not sure?
I think if you can take me as an example at all, of if you're considering it, look into it, get armed, talk to women, and do it. If it's not a cheap procedure, but you spend a lot of money on Starbucks daily, you spend a lot of money on vacations. This is something that, in terms of emotional security, and it's something that I really needed at that point in my life, it gives you that, and then you can start doing other things. And I think the lift it took off me from sort of the pressure I had put on myself and anxiety, that lift was a monumental shift in terms of where I went after I froze my eggs. It opened, um, it was just almost a huge sigh of relief.
I think you've been a game changer for most women. So thank you for telling your story.
Thank you.
All right. Well, see you later. Bye.
Bye.